Welcome to Catalista's Holy Moly, What a Life. Coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. My name is Ed Goldberg. So, what is Holy Moly, What a Life? These are the stories of trailblazers whose legacies ebb and flow through time, embodying the potential to inspire new discoveries and enhance life for generations to come. Our first episode is all about Richard Buckminster Fuller. Now, if you've never heard of Fuller, we're going to take you through his life and works in 6 chapters. On the opening page of his masterwork, Synergetics, Fuller has a request for his readers, and that is, dare to be naive. With that in mind, let's plunge into the life of Bucky Fuller. Fuller loved to talk about tools, and one of the most astounding tools he left us is his Synergetics Dictionary. You can find a Synergetics Dictionary online, but here at the Catalista Centrale studios, we have a real-life Synergetics Dictionary Rolodex. Now, I'm betting a lot of you have no idea what a Rolodex is, but it was a rotating card file device used to hold business cards or addresses. Our Synergetics Dictionary looks like a narrow Ferris wheel. It's about 10 feet high, 6 inches wide, and it's full of index cards. I'm just going to give it a spin here. We are looking for card number 12,381. And the word we want to begin with is omnidirectional. So 12,100, 200, and here it is. This is Bucky from a lecture from 1960. Because of the incessant wheeling about of humans, first in the womb, then in the baby carriage, then on foot, in the auto and ship and plane, round about a spinning Earth, in a spinning solar system, within an evoluting, spirally spinning galaxy. Totally inventoried experiences are inherently omnidirectional when considered as the sum of observational orientations. Chapter 1: The Omnidirectional Life and Work of R. Buckminster Fuller. Bonnie DeVarco, first of all, it's wonderful to have you as part of the show and to have you sort of guide us through the life and work of Richard Buckminster Fuller.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
To begin, why don't you tell us your connection to Bucky Fuller, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, great. So I actually go back a long way with Buckminster Fuller. I was introduced to his work through, of all things, Synergetics 2, his magnum opus on geometry, which is a heady read. I opened it from the center and read outward, which is actually the way you're supposed to read it. But that got me deeply into the urgent and passionate messages that Buckminster Fuller had for all of us back in the early 80s, when I was one of the last groups of students where he had 1,000 audience members watching him for 6 hours, standing room only in various universities around the country. I saw him a number of times and was able to talk to him very briefly, only once, but his impact in my life was huge because I was putting myself through college and it centered me on a much bigger way to look at the world. So as I was going through college, I ended up finding myself right smack in the middle of his collection, his archives. Now, Bucky was one of the most well-documented human beings ever. I think most of us don't know this about him because he is more known for the artifacts that he left us. But the greatest artifact really was his life story, his lifetime experiment as guinea pig bee. And that's where I found myself when the archives needed a steward, needed a lot of help to stay organized. And I was lucky enough to work with it intensively for 6 years within the way that the 20 different sections of his archives were organized. I was able to really understand his work from a different vantage point after I'd already studied every book he'd ever read, listened to him many times for 10 years. So I ended up continuing with his work. No matter what I did, I kept on coming back to the work of Buckminster Fuller through these past about 40 years.
We're going to get into this in more detail in the different questions we have for you, but if you could sum it up in a nutshell, as a starter, who was Buckminster Fuller and why should we care about him today?
Great question. Back in his lifetime, toward the later part of his lifetime of almost 88 years, he was considered the world's friendly genius. He was a Renaissance man of his age. A lot of us thought of him as the Leonardo da Vinci of the 20th century. He created many artifacts. The most important one that we know of is the geodesic dome. But what his lifetime experiment left us with was an incredible conceptual tool set to really move forward in this century. And he was doing it in last century.
In his lifetime, he really wasn't taken so seriously, and he was kind of obscure in some ways. And today, he's not well known. What do you think of all that?
Yes, so Bucky was the ultimate liminal agent. And liminal means you're not quite one thing, you're not quite the other. You fit in between in the interstices of life. And that's what he did. And that worked well for him as a comprehensive thinker, but it did not work well for him as a non-specialist. So he was against specialization and really wanted to look at the whole picture. And in academia, he did not do so well in that in his early years. He never graduated from Harvard. He was kicked out twice. But his experience in academia was very different than most. He was a professor in 150 universities, yet he never really wrote an academic paper. He did not cite other people in his works. He preferred to write his almost 30 books and publish them in the popular press, although he also worked in conjunction with a number of scientists. So it's really hard to pinpoint what it was that made him so obscure, except for the fact that he talked about everything all at once, all the time. And it was very confusing to academics, especially because you're supposed to move into these specializations. And he wasn't a specialist in any particular thing, but he was more than a jack of all trades, let's say. So he was pushed out of the academic world, but became very famous toward the end of his life, especially because of the geodesic dome and because of all of the talks that he was doing around the world at universities all over the world, and also for large groups of people in events that had nothing to do with academia.
And why did he refer to himself as Guinea Pig B?
Well, Guinea Pig B, when he was 32 in 1927, he really had a crisis of confidence and he almost committed suicide. And at that time, he had just had a new baby and he asked these questions about whether he was useful to the universe. And he was ready to throw himself away. And he went to a deep place in his spirit, and he speaks about it as a spiritual experience where he was floating up in a sphere and he was told, you don't belong to you, you belong to the universe. So he was taking stock of anything that he did in his life that mattered. And what he found is the things that made a biggest difference in life was when he served all of humanity, when he didn't focus on one thing or the other. And so he decided, okay, I'm going to do a lifetime experiment. I'm going to call myself Guinea Pig B, B for Bucky, and I'm going to devote my life to all of humanity to see what one individual can do. Now, I want to read just one little quote that I love that I had in the overview of his archives in the old days. He wrote, In 1917, at the age of 22, I decided to become guinea pig B for Bucky. In this lifelong project, he was going to actually document the life of human individual. Mortality rate was in the 40s, so he thought it would be maybe 10 years. But he was noticing and experiencing the rippling effect of Einstein's work, where he saw the world as moving into an Einsteinian world where everything was moving, nothing was static, everything was invisible, and we just didn't see the patterns and the structure. So this was an idea he had that he was an ordinary human being, but the rigor that he had for the next 56 years, because he lived till he was almost 88, 6 days short of 88, I believe, that this lifetime experiment as a guinea pig B really gave him the rigor to document everything that came in and out of his life throughout his life, while he was also becoming a Renaissance thinker, while his work and documentation reflected a human being who was rather a genius. It's a longitudinal study of genius if you look at the result of this lifetime experiment as guinea pig B.
Alec Nevala-Lee, he's a biographer, a novelist, science fiction writer. He's known for his Hugo-nominated book Astounding, John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction. He wrote the recent biography of Buckminster Fuller. It's called Inventor of the Future. Esquire magazine called it one of the top 50 biographies of all time. Alec, if you were to be speaking to a young audience who have no notion of who Fuller was, how would you describe who was Buckminster Fuller and why does he matter?
When I talk to audiences or to people that don't already know who Fuller was, I tend to go in two directions. One is I ask them to visualize Spaceship Earth, Epcot Center. So this is the famous geodesic sphere that's a ride, Walt Disney World. That sphere is a design that is based on Buckminster Fuller's most famous single idea, which is the geodesic dome. And it's named Spaceship Earth, which is Fuller's most famous metaphor. So that structure is an homage to Fuller. It is a structure that was conceived in the late 70s and built in the early 80s to symbolize the future. And the fact that Disney draws very clearly on Fuller's ideas to create this image really speaks to his prominence in the culture at that time. He is no longer quite as famous as he used to be during his lifetime, but that sphere testifies to how influential and famous he was at that point. You know, he was the person you looked to when you wanted to talk about the future, about technology, about design, all these things that I think are embodied in that ride. So that's one thing I talk about. And the other thing I talk about is I think of Fuller as sort of the prototype for the modern startup founder. We have a certain image in mind of this visionary technologist. So Steve Jobs is probably the most famous example, but today we have Elon Musk. You can name your choice of sort of the Silicon Valley visionaries. And Fuller is sort of the prototype. He is someone who was talking in these terms and using these strategies and framing design in these ways from the 1920s onward. And he got really famous in the 60s when he was an older man and actually had a huge direct influence on the people that would end up going on to found Silicon Valley. So that culture that arises in the Bay Area in the early 70s is looking to Fuller. And if you were like a young person like Steve Jobs, who is looking to influence the world through technology, Fuller is an incredible source of metaphors and ideas. And you can see that influence even now. I'm not saying that figure of the startup founder is always entirely positive, but I think it's important to understand where these people come from and the tools they use to get things done. And I think Fuller is interesting, both because he was a direct influence on people like this, but also because, his career is very well documented. You can kind of see the steps he took to achieve things like the dome and his other design projects in ways that are very clear, I think, when you look at the sources. And so I think if you're interested in this kind of person, whether because you want to be that person or you're wary of that person, you're skeptical of that person, Fuller is a good case study for you to look at.
We're back in the studios, and it's time to give our big synergetic wheel a spin. And we're looking for card 19,647. If you're wondering how many cards make up the Synergetics Dictionary, that number is 21,188. The first card says this: Catalog of a Mind. Let's read two cards. Here's number 19,671, universe. Of all the complexes that we know in our universe, there is no organic complex that in any way compares with that of the human being. We have only one counterpart of total complexity, and that is universe itself. That such a complex miniature universe is found to be present on this planet, and that it is born absolutely ignorant, is part of the manifold of design integrities. Card number 19,665, also universe. If, for one instance, we could really come to understand our universe and could perceive ourselves as really one with the universe, we wouldn't have to consider such a word as tragedy. I don't think the universe is a failure. As far as we can see, the universe is the minimum eternal self-regenerative system. So we can only think of it as a complete success. It includes everything we experience, and all of it has logical and really sublime integrity. Chapter 2, The Game of Universe. Fuller spoke about playing the game universe, which requires absolute integrity in his words. Alec, what was the game universe for Fuller, and what does he mean by integrity?
So one thing about Fuller that I think it's important to establish is that a lot of his ideas are based on geometry. Fuller was really fascinated by geometry from an early age and spent a lot of time developing what he ends up calling synergetics, which is this geometric philosophy that's based on the triangle instead of the square, and the tetrahedron, or the triangular pyramid, instead of the cube. And he spends years and years elaborating this system of geometry. He describes it as, these are the rules that the universe follows, that nature follows, when it builds things, when it creates patterns. And so that's kind of like the prologue here, because when you asked, it's a good example of how Fuller's geometry informs his philosophy and vice versa. Because Fuller thinks about the universe in a very specific way. So one thing I can say about his view of the universe is that he always spells it with a capital U. And why is this? To him, the universe is a place. It's a specific location. It's like Baltimore or Pleasantville. It is a place we happen to live in. And so it deserves a capital letter, like any place name. And it's a scenario. The best way to describe it is almost as like this huge three-dimensional game board where every individual and every object of the universe has a limited number of moves in the game. So you are constrained in what you can do at any given point by the geometry of the universe around you. And you can move in certain directions, you can make certain choices, but you're not entirely free to make those choices. But you do have free will. And this is where the idea of integrity comes in. Because with Fuller, on the one hand, he's describing the geometry of the universe in a very abstract kind of way, where he's saying this is how objects move through space and time. But he's also talking about people. He's talking about individuals, because with Fuller, everything is connected, and everything that he's saying, there's a geometrical aspect to it, but to him, there's also this ethical aspect to it, which is how does the individual behave under those circumstances? We're all dropped into this game of universe that we're expected to start playing from the day we're born, and the choices that we make at any given time are very important. And so for Fuller, he comes back to this idea of integrity, and it's a little hard to describe what he means sometimes because he doesn't always define it. But I think it helps to think of integrity kind of in the original sense as wholeness. Integrity refers to integration of all the parts into one whole. And this is an important concept to Fuller because Fuller is very much against specialization. He says, we are encouraged to specialize too soon. We miss the big picture. We should address every problem starting on the level of the universe itself and then work our way down so that we don't miss anything important. And so when he says integrity, I think what he's saying is an approach to solving problems that takes the whole into account. It takes the big picture into account. And I think Fuller thinks that a lot of the mistakes that we make as individuals and as a society come from overlooking the big picture. And so for him, integrity means always bearing in mind the whole and guiding your actions accordingly so that you're always adding to the order of the universe. You're not increasing disorder. You're making things more efficient instead of less efficient. And you're always conscious of the larger impact of your decisions.
Bonnie, when I think back to my experience with geometry, it's pretty bleak. I took a geometry summer class and I got a D. I was totally perplexed, had no idea what was going on. But then some years later, after college, I found the work of Fuller, and somehow his approach to geometry transfixed me. I just found it so magical, and something about it just spoke so deeply to me. So, can we talk about Fuller's geometry and what's the significance of his work in geometry?
Yeah. So geometry was really the centerpiece of his thought. And it all really started when he was just 5 years old and he couldn't see and he didn't have big, thick glasses that he ended up wearing for the rest of his life. And he was working with peas and toothpicks and was asked to make a structure that was strong. And he found the strongest structure that he could make without seeing with these peas and toothpicks was a tetrahedron. And his geometry really grew from that experience and also his fascination with the sphere. And again, another thing, which was his Navy experience and his experience as a sailor that influenced the way that he saw the bubbles behind the ship or the fluid dynamics. He was a little bit like Leonardo, looking at nature really carefully and seeing things that most people aren't able to see. So he started making models to understand what he called nature's technology. And that was not something that was static. And he was the very first in the whole history of polyhedra, which is three-dimensional structures, to introduce polyhedra as energy systems. So as he was creating ideas for artifacts that could help change humanity, particularly shelter, and map that would embrace a different view of this wild and changing world that he was experiencing, the geometry was the centerpiece of his philosophy as well. That all goes down and back to spherical trigonometry, which was the tool of celestial navigators, the navigators who used the stars to tell both time and space on the sea. He was deeply familiar with that. And although he knew spherical trigonometry, he wasn't an expert at any mathematics or geometry. That actually came when he was working with students in the 40s and the 50s to really find another level of exactitude in the model making that he was doing. Another aspect of model making, he said, if you can't make a model of it, don't talk about it. Or at least that was one of his self-disciplines. So he was making models of design from the inside out, which was really kind of fascinating because if you think about it, he put himself in the center of the sphere, which was very resonant with this avalanche of words that came to him after that experience in the sphere, as he's floating up in the sphere and being told, you belong to universe. So he felt that geometry was the doorway in.
Daniel Lopez is an architect, a scholar, who's known for his work on modern architecture, technology, and design research. Also, Daniel is a renowned curator. He curated Geoscope 2 Worlds. It was an immersive exhibition addressing societal and environmental challenges, which appeared at the Venice Biennale. Daniel is the author of the critically acclaimed R. Buckminster Fuller Pattern Thinking. Daniel, what is energetic geometry in contrast to Euclidean geometry?
The short answer is that for Buckminster Fuller, geometry was alive. Geometry was so much more than lines. Lines are material. They are lines of force. They are lines of energy. They are tension. They're lines of resources and shipping lanes. And geometry is constantly being expanded. And geometry is always relational. Bucky begins to conceive of the idea that geometry is an instant in a constant state of transformation. And that is absolutely his most concrete and revolutionary discovery, because in a way, it moves us from understanding geometry as static, geometry as defined, and it expands that horizon.
Could you do your best to help a listening audience try to visualize what that means?
If we think of Platonic solids and their geometrical properties, they have been, by and large, conceived conventionally as discrete objects. Here's a tetrahedron, here's a cube, and these things have stood across time as almost seemingly unrelated. Even though we know that there are geometrical rules that apply to their relationships, these things have been drawn in books, have been explained to us in school as fixed Platonic solid. It's unchanging. What Buckminster Fuller does is he begins to imagine the process by which one figure is able to transform into the next, and the next into the next. And now, how does a tetrahedron or an icosahedron fold on an octahedron? By folding its faces, by migrating its vertices. Whereas these transformations are explained mathematically, he begins to build models that show us that folding the face, and the simplest way to describe it is imagine a cube and you begin to fold each of its faces diagonally into two faces. Suddenly you begin to produce another figure and another figure. And the jitterbug transformation, it's a mathematical transformation that Bucky calls the jitterbug. And the jitterbug is a name from a 1940s popular American dance where bodies are moving sideways. There's a kind of a momentum, and then there's a kind of a spin. If one follows it mathematically, there is a seamless process by which you get one figure turning into the next, and returning back to the original figure. So in a way, discrete Platonic solids are only a momentary instance of a continuous process of transformation. This pushing and pulling is this pulsation, and Bucky would describe it as pumping. And the pumping is what allows for that radial movement to transform one figure onto the next. And that is an extraordinary, particularly in the world of design and architecture, to imagine geometry not as a definite or as a defined entity, but actually as inherently alive and moving. One requires energy. So Bucky, from the beginning of time, described lines as lines and then lines of force immediately, so that there is energy, there's tension. In his manuals, he draws mathematical properties, but he draws them not in a conventional geometrical manner, but rather like models. And he draws physical models representing geometrical properties. And there's always that kind of ambiguity of, am I looking at an image of geometry translated into a physical model, or am I looking at a physical model representing geometrical properties that have geometrical characteristics and so on? And that kind of expanded thinking is, once again, that idea of patterns and their manifestation across many, many mediums.
So, Alec, Fuller takes a ball and zeroes in on the fact that you can pack 12 balls of the same size around that central sphere. What are the implications of this model that he comes to call the vector equilibrium?
So Fuller's approach to geometry is very hands-on. This is one of the things I find very appealing about his ideas. It's that he was not a mathematician. He was not trained in this stuff in a formal sense. He was at home at his dining room table with these models he builds. He's building these models out of spheres and out of sticks and string and wire. So a lot of these ideas come out of this very hands-on approach. And one thing that he discovers is that if you take a sphere, like a billiard ball, let's say, and you start to pack other balls around it, the closest packing of those spheres takes on a certain shape. When you're trying to pack them as tightly as possible, you end up with this construction that has one sphere at the center and then 12 spheres arranged all around it. And if you take the centers of those spheres and connect them, you end up with a polyhedron, a shape that has 8 triangular and 6 square faces. And he calls this the vector equilibrium. You could go a lot further with the technical side of Fuller's geometry and all these terms he invents. One sphere in the center, you have 12 spheres around it. And to him, this symbolizes the degrees of movement that are possible to a object in the universe. This is like a little bit hard to get your head around sometimes. But if you can picture yourself as that sphere at the center, you have 12 options around you because you have 12 other spheres that are arranged in closest packing around you there at the center. And to Fuller, this kind of defines this, it's like a matrix. It's like huge network of possible directions you can take. And as I said before, it's not unlimited. There are finite moves that are available to you in the universe. And so Fuller envisions what he later calls the isotropic vector matrix, which is this massive network of all the possible directions that an object can take in space and time.
Anything else come to mind when you think about the 12 degrees of freedom?
With Fuller, everything has a metaphorical meaning. Everything has a meaning that you can use by analogy to apply to human life. And so for him, when he talks about the 12 degrees of freedom, he's talking about geometry, but in a weird way, he's also talking about ethics. He's talking about these choices that we have available to us at any given time. To him, it's almost this tool you can use to conceive of your situation, the range of options you have available to you. His whole point is that these concepts can be used to build intuition. They can be used to guide your decision-making because they provide you with these concepts that are useful in design and also just useful in terms of thinking of the universe. And it can be a little hard to explain why this is true. But with Fuller, he's always going back to geometry. He's always going back to these concepts that, on some levels, there's like a mystical side to his ideas. He is looking at geometry, not just like a mathematician or a designer would, but also in the way a mystic would. So it can be a little bit hard to pin him down sometimes. But I think it's important to realize that all these things, the geometry, the ethics, the philosophy, the design, they're all kind of part of one big vision. And one of the challenges in talking about Fuller is teasing out the different aspects of his thinking.
Bonnie, would you like to add anything to our discussion of closely packed spheres and 12 degrees of freedom?
Yes. And part of that was, again, starting in the center and thinking about ourselves on a sphere that is traveling through the world, orbiting through the universe and around the sun at 66,000 miles an hour and spinning around its axis at 1,000 miles an hour, that you are really in a situation where up and down doesn't matter anymore. It is in and out, not up and down. It is, instead of seeing the sun rise, it's a sunset. Instead of seeing the sun set, it's a sun eclipse because it's eclipsing the spherical Earth. So his essential understanding of what he called 12 degrees of freedom was the many different outward spokes of the center of the sphere. And when you're traveling in space or in the air, you have 6 degrees of freedom, which is the X, Y, Z, and roll, pitch, and yaw. So he was thinking about doubling that because you're going from the inside to the outside. So the other key part of this was that the center was twisting. So in looking at the omnidirectionality of the motion of a sphere or its impact on another moving body, he was able to think deeper about how would you omnitriangulate the sphere in order to show data on the sphere and move it from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And going back to his fascination with geometry as this energetic, continuously changing thing, he was able to demonstrate how polyhedra changed from one into the other with his jitterbug that Daniel spoke about very nicely. So this really impacted not only his development of the Dymaxion map and the geoscope that you're in the center of as you're viewing the scenarios of the Earth from the inside, but also the geodesic dome, which happened fairly at the same time as the completion of his mathematical development of the map happened. So there's these 2 streams of his work that had to do with what does the world look like that shelter is going to land in, and what type of shelter is going to be most useful for the mobile connected human, for the planetary citizen. So he was looking at shelter systems on a medio scale. He was looking at nature on a micro scale, and he was looking at Earth on a macro scale, and always starting with universe.
Card number 19,654. Universe, in turn, must be all that isn't me and me. The only difference between universe and environment is me, the observer. Synergetics Dictionary was compiled by E.J. Applewhite. Applewhite also helped craft and organize the books Synergetics 1 and 2. Fuller describes the dictionary as, quote, a systematic, nonlinear, variorum selection and self-branching arrangement of the concepts, definitions, and generalized principles discovered or formulated by R. Buckminster Fuller. Let's go to card 20,199, verb. Physics has not found any things. It has only found energy events that are continually transforming. Only verbs are applicable. There are no nouns because there are no things. Chapter 3, I appear to be a verb. Here's Bonnie DeVarco.
He's looking at polyhedra as energy systems. He's looking at the human body as a continuously changing thing. So he said, and I'll quote, "I live on Earth at present, and I don't know what I am. I know that I am not a category. I am not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe."
Alec, what does Fuller mean by pattern integrity?
Pattern integrity is a fun concept that comes out of Fuller's geometry. And the analogy that he likes to use is a piece of rope. So if you have a piece of rope that is made of one material like nylon, and another piece of rope that's made of manila or hemp, and another piece of rope that's made of cotton, let's say, you can take these three pieces of rope and splice them together into one piece. So it starts as manila, then becomes hemp, and then becomes cotton, let's say. And then you tie a knot at one end, and if the knot is loose enough, you can pass that knot along the rope. You kind of like picture it. You're sliding the knot down from one end of the rope to the other. And as the knot moves along the rope, it changes material because on one end, it is a manila rope. And so the knot is made of manila. But if you keep going, the material changes. And so suddenly your knot is made of hemp. And then toward the end, it becomes a knot of cotton. And it's the same knot, but the materials have changed. And Fuller loves this image. And his point is that the knot is not the material of which it is made. The knot is a pattern. The knot is a pattern that is independent of the physical manifestation of the knot at any one time. And what he's getting at here is that this is true of everything. It's true of human beings, for example. So he likes to point out that if you're a human being, you have consumed tons of water and food and air over the course of a lifetime that temporarily is absorbed into your body and then passes out of it again. And that means that you are not that material. Your individuality, your pattern as an individual is independent of the physical materials that make up the body. And he repeats this many times. And I find it really fascinating because he is onto something here. I think he is famous for a sentence, "I seem to be a verb. I'm not a noun, I'm a verb." And so he conceives of people and he conceives of objects not so much in terms of their physical selves, but as their actions and as the pattern of forces that define them. And again, I said this before, this is a geometrical concept. This is a concept that comes out of his geometry and the idea about the rules of how the universe works. But it's also an ethical principle. It is advice that Fuller is giving to his listeners. And he's saying that you are not your body. You are not your current circumstances. You are a pattern that is passing through time, almost like a knot passing through time that is something other than the visible, than the tangible. Asking yourself, what is that pattern? What am I? And when I realize that I am something other than my physical self is, I think, a pretty powerful concept. I think people have heard that concept and have been inspired to think about themselves and their lives in different ways. I think it's actually one of Fuller's most powerful ideas.
Daniel, what is synergy and how does it challenge the way education is usually approached?
In my mind, synergy is asking us to identify part-to-whole relationships. Through his teaching across many design programs, Buckminster Fuller is constantly assembling manuals with his students, manuals of these geodesic orders, starting with a whole and then begin to divide it into parts. So we can think of part to whole relationships and parts as not predetermining the behavior of the whole and vice versa, that from a whole, you're not immediately bound to understand the part, and the systems thinking as this kind of larger search, this emphasis on larger systems and on part to whole relationships also have a huge legacy in contemporary design. I mean, we are constantly testing the relationships. Computer-aided design allows us to model things that have such high degree of complexity that it is impossible to almost be in control of the entire system. It's one of his mantras. The part doesn't predetermine the behavior of the whole, and vice versa, that there is a complexity to the whole that's much larger.
Alec, according to Fuller, human beings have a tiny little bandwidth that we can tune in, and that it's less than a millionth of reality. What are your thoughts on this observation? And what's the meaning of tunable relevancy?
This is actually a very interesting concept. So Fuller is very interested in the idea of how do we process the information around us. And he points out, I think correctly, that there are certain things that are too big for us to see firsthand, patterns, let's say, that are too large or too slow for us to see. And then there are things that are too small for us to see. And our senses and the human mind occupies this band of relevancy, this band of information that we can perceive that is kind of in between the very big and the very small. And I think this is a very interesting concept. Fuller's goal is to expand the extent of that band. So he's saying that we can nudge our perceptions up and down to expand the range of things that we can perceive. And this is kind of where the geometry comes in. So he has this incredible system of geometry with these tetrahedra, these triangles, and all these rules, these axioms. Why is he doing this? And I think the way I see it is that he is giving you tools to refine your intuition. Because for him, intuition is a huge part of how he arrives at solutions. And intuition is kind of a shortcut where you don't have the ability to process all this information, but you have refined your intuition to guide you in the right direction. And he sees his geometry as a way of guiding intuition. So you can argue how useful it actually is, or to what extent he actually used it. But that's sort of the rationale here. He is giving you these tools to look at the universe and maybe slightly expand the range of things you can understand. And not everyone would agree that he has the right set of tools, but I think that's a very powerful concept. I think the idea of trying to arrive at a model of the world that makes sense to you, that allows you to perceive things that you would have missed otherwise, is a very interesting idea. And I think that Fuller, say what you will about the specific rules he arrives at, but he pursued that goal in a very active way. And a lot of people have found those tools to be valuable.
Was Fuller saying that there is a technical solution to humanity's problems with collaboration?
Well, an artifactual solution. Every technology we have, and this is why he called nature's design process nature's technology. Everything that we have is an extension of our body, an extension of our mind, an extension of our senses. And we are at a point, we continue to be at this point for decades, where we could utilize all of these tools differently. But there are many reasons why we aren't. And nobody has the answer. Bucky just wanted to offer solutions, not final answers to anything. But he did feel that urgency. And I think this is why all of us loved him so much, is the urgency he had to get people on board with this program. And again, I keep on saying stewardship. That's what we're here for. We're here to be an extension of what's possible on planet Earth and within the regenerative universe. So we had this feeling of awe that we had that led us to watch him for hours and hours and led him to speak for hours, even in his 80s. That urgency was so important because he was banging the drum in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And here we are, and we can utilize his solutions, but we can use better technologies and the confluence of these technologies to realize some of the ideals that he held. We still aren't collaborating well or working in synchrony with each other. And Bucky was apolitical for all of his life, really. He said we cannot change human beings, but we can change the environment. and the tools that they have at hand to use. And that will change, in turn, their behaviors. So his idea was to create a body of materials that could be used as these tools when humanity was ready for it. And they certainly weren't in the last century during World War I or World War II, during the many wars since then. And right now, we're still in the middle of the dichotomy of autocracy and democracy around the world. So we don't really have a unified voice yet. And I honestly thought it would happen in my lifetime. It has not. I don't know if it will happen, but what we do know is with the accelerated acceleration, we have better technologies and a better confluence of technologies than we ever had before, which can create better tools than Bucky even conceived of. So we have everything we need to turn ourselves around to becoming stewards. And that was the bottom line of Bucky's lifetime experiment.
What was Fuller's relationship to capitalism? And how does it relate to his belief that no one need commit to the pursuit of earning a living?
So Fuller's view of capitalism is very ambivalent. And it comes out of his experiences as someone who's trying to get things done in America in the 20th century. Because starting in the 20s, he has this idea for a housing industry. He wants to build a house that can be manufactured in a factory and delivered anywhere in the country. And so his original plan requires an immense amount of capital. And he seeks investors starting in the late 20s in a very aggressive way. He's going out there with his models and his manifesto that he's written and trying to raise money and trying to generate interest in this project. And he does succeed to some extent in getting some funding, some interest from investors, primarily to build what he calls the Demaxian car, which is a vehicle that is sort of like a piece of the house that can drive off by itself. It's like a subset of his housing program that is actually easier in some ways to realize than building the entire house. He'll build this car instead. So he raises money for that. But he actually has trouble kind of on the business front. Fuller is never what you would call a great businessman. And he feels frustrated. He is going after, investors and making these huge claims for his ideas, which he does think have the potential to transform society. But people are often skeptical. He's running up against this dilemma where he has these ideas, but he can only realize them using other people's money. And so starting in the 30s, you see this thread in his writing, in his thinking, that is very critical of capitalism. He is saying that what he calls financial capital or FinCap is hoarding resources. It is making it impossible for resources to be distributed equitably to people. Early on, and this is a theme that he talks about throughout his career, he points out that if you take the energy and the wealth available in the world, there should be more than enough to guarantee everyone a comfortable life. That we have more than enough to provide for all of humanity. And the fact that we are not doing this is a failure of political and corporate imagination, that we should be able to provide for everyone by using the resources that we already have more efficiently. And he basically sees eventually the idea of the nation state and the capitalist system interfering with the free distribution of resources. And he eventually comes to support what I think is almost a precursor to the idea of the universal basic income. That everyone should get a certain amount of money each month to pay for their basic needs automatically, because as an individual, as a human being, you are entitled to a share of the world's wealth. And this is something that he is talking about starting in the early 30s, which, I think is really remarkable, because this is an issue that has become more prominent, at least in the US, more recently. But Fuller is talking about this very early on. So this to me is actually one of the most appealing parts of his philosophy, because I agree with him. I think the barriers to providing for everyone at a minimum level of comfort and survival, these are not technical problems. The technology exists, the resources are there, these are failures of political will. And then you asked about this idea that the individual doesn't have to worry about earning a living. So this is kind of like a two-part issue. So for Fuller, the ideal is that eventually, once we realize that the world has enough resources to provide for everyone, we will set up these systems in place that will provide people with the universal basic income, and that will allow them to do whatever they want. They won't have to worry about earning a living, so they can work if they want to, but they can go fly fishing. They can go back to school. They can learn about the things that they thought were interesting when they were children, because their basic needs are being provided for. And this is kind of like a future utopian scenario that Fuller is envisioning. Then he also says that he advises young people here and now to focus on problems that need to be solved and to kind of forget about the issue of earning a living. The idea is that if you are a person who is able to identify problems that need to be addressed and can come up with design solutions that will address them, then you don't have to worry about pursuing a conventional career. And this is a message that he says again and again, starting, I would say, in the 60s. This becomes a prominent part of his message because he's addressing an audience of young people, college kids mostly, who are frustrated and who do kind of see politics and systems that are currently in place as interfering with the way the world ought to be. And I think this is a very powerful message. I will say that it is a message that comes from a place of privilege with Fuller. Fuller comes from a background where he could decide to go out and tackle these problems and, in his case, failed repeatedly to make them viable without worrying about falling out of the upper class. He came from a prominent family. He had a lot of resources that most people don't have. And so there is a caveat here that I think is important to say, that I think Fuller assumes that people can afford to fail repeatedly and can afford to reject the system that he doesn't believe in. And this is true of him. It's true of a lot of his admirers. It's true of young people in the counterculture in the 60s. It's not true of everyone. If you're coming from a disadvantaged background, if you are a woman, if you're a person of color, I think that advice is harder to follow. And I don't think Fuller ever entirely recognized that.
If you'd like to hear a different take on universal basic income, you can have a listen to another Catalista program. It's episode 1 of 2 Minutes to Midnight, an extravaganza. Card 20,198. Architecture, like music, will be a verb and not a noun. Card 16,463. Spaceship Earth. I just say to all of you, hello, astronauts. You're all astronauts. I'm sure you're not thinking of yourselves as astronauts, or you wouldn't have the word for somebody else. But you're all astronauts. You never have been anything else. You've just got to catch up on that. You're all astronauts. It's a very small little ship we've got here. It's superbly equipped, and every part of it is reciprocal. There are no labels on it which say anything belongs to anybody. Everything that's there is to regenerate all of life. Chapter 4. The Stewards of Spaceship Earth. Bonnie, tell us about Bucky's concept of the one-world town and how that leads to the Dymaxion map, the geoscope, and world game.
Yes, well, actually, he did start with the one-town world. He did many sketches during that period when he was so entranced by this flow of information that was coming in. And he was asking that question, do I have a purpose? Does humanity have a purpose? And what is that? So he was actually seeing humans early on as local information gatherers and global problem solvers. He felt that we needed new kinds of tools to become stewards or to become a more functional humanity. And he was bound and determined to create that. So when he started, he drew many views of this one town world idea where we were connected as a one world island in a one ocean world. So he's developing this notion of a map that can go from 3D to 2D way back when he was looking at the one town world. How are you going to express data using this concept or a new kind of map that would enable us to create different kinds of views of what it would mean if a number of us carried out a particular process or created particular things or used certain materials through the course of 50 years. So he was always thinking 50 years forward, and his map became part of this evolution of the map and the geoscope and the geodesic dome. In 1940, he was able to create the first energy map where he was looking at world energy flows and the curves of change that were on Earth. And at that time, the map did not have a grid on it. So while he was working with these ideas of geometry or the geometry of the sphere, by 1943 to 1946, he was able to pinpoint the one polyhedron that could express the least amount of distortion, and that was the cuboctahedron. Then in 1952, Shoji Sadao, his student and colleague for the rest of his life, had created a UN map. It was never published, but it was the very first icosahedral map. So you're watching this evolution of from one polyhedron to a much better polyhedron that is much closer to the sphere. In 1954, he was able to patent not only the geodesic dome, but also the icosahedral map. So it is trademarked, not patented. Then that grew into much later the world game concept and big map. But if you look at his idea of a geoscope specifically, the geoscope was the three-dimensional view. Now, whenever you're looking at a sphere, you can only see 1/3 at any one time. He thought that if you're inside of the sphere, you can see about 5/8 of the sphere. So if you're just looking up and the zenith point is where you are on the Earth, then you're going to be able to see almost the whole series of contours, let's say, of the continental contours of this one world island. And the first geoscopes, actually, the first geodesics were geoscopes. So there's this really nice braiding of his development cycle for the Dymaxion map, the geoscope, and world game.
Medard Gabel worked with Buckminster Fuller for 12 years. He's now the executive director of EarthGame, a research and development organization. He also leads Global Solutions Lab, World Game Institute, and the Regeneration Project at Rodale Press. He's the author of Energy, Earth, and Everyone, Designs for a World That Works for All, and his most recent book is 8 Billion Billionaires. Medard, what was the geoscope and what was its function?
Buckminster Fuller was interested in making visible the invisible. He was interested in what today you can even get a PhD in information visualization. How do you communicate the important stuff out there on the planet? And the geoscope was in a long line of innovative ways of visualizing what's happening on this planet. Just like a microscope or a telescope is enabling us to see what's invisible to our normal eyesight, the geoscope was to allow us to see big patterns taking shape on this planet. You look out the window and you see what's going on in your backyard or the city street, wherever you're living. You don't see much of the planet. It's an infinitesimal dot. And the geoscope was to give us a view of the whole and to see patterns that were going either too slow or too fast, like population growth from 1950 to 2000 to 2022 as it spreads around the world, or even from 10,000 BC on up to 1800, 1850, to see large-scale patterns as they show up on the planet and in a geographical context, not just to see the pattern. You could see that in a line graph of population growth, but to see its geographical distribution. So it was a tool for seeing the world, understanding the world, and seeing if there's any problems or if there are situations we need to deal with. Population is just one thing, but there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of other variables that are out there now having to do with the world, its resources, its problems, its options.
Could you talk about what it actually looked like? What was it physically?
So physically, it was a large geodesic sphere, a dome that was the whole circle. And on the outer sphere was the image of the Earth. If you're inside the sphere, center of it, you're looking out and there's Africa, there's Europe, over there is Antarctica, North, South America, China, Asia. What's on the surface of this geoscope would be a series of data displays to show you what's happening on the planet. In my opinion, The geoscope was beautiful. It was brilliant, a way of visualizing the world, but it had a serious problem, which Fuller remedied with the next advance of the geoscope. And the problem is you can't see the whole world at one time. If you're looking at North America, well, the other side of the world, Asia, Europe, Australia, you needed a flat surface to see the whole world at one time. And that was remedied by what we used in the world game, this giant map of the whole world. The giant meant the size of a basketball court that you walked on.
Could you describe the Dymaxion map and what makes it so compelling?
Map makers for centuries have been trying to figure out how to accurately show information from a sphere that when it's laid flat, there's little distortion. The Mercator map, which is, again, a brilliant innovation in its day, 500 years ago, showed an accurate view of the world, but mostly at the equator. The poles were grossly distorted. Greenland was the size of South America, whereas in fact it's 1/10 the size. And Fuller figured out a way mathematically of taking the information off of the sphere and laying it flat so there wasn't any visual distortion, which is critically important if you're trying to fly over Greenland, for example, and you're using the Mercator projection and it's 100 times the size that it actually is in real life, you've got a serious problem. And so your view of the world, if it is distorted enough, they institutionalize you. You could make the case that us folks, us human beings on Spaceship Earth, as Fuller called it, needed to be institutionalized with our old view of the world. It was so distorted. It was so inaccurate. Fuller figured out a way that you saw the whole world, all of the land masses, as one interconnected island at the bottom of this air ocean. He turned the sphere, a globe, into a spherical icosahedron. Icosahedron is a 20-sided platonic solid. It was a structure that was as near spherical as you can have a simple structure. Fuller laid it flat on the icosahedron and then opened up the icosahedron and laid it flat from a geographical point of view as well as from a data point of view. How do you display the world, the state of the world, what's going on a surface that you and I can look at and understand? Here's population, energy, food, shelter, healthcare, the resource use, pollution, climate change, all of the important issues of the day. How do you display them so that we can see them and get a better feel for what's going on this planet?
Well, I think that's a nice introduction to talk about World Game, and this is something that's been near and dear to your heart for many years. Could you tell us what is World Game and what does it aim to achieve?
World Game was a tool for recognizing, defining, and solving global problems and local problems in a global context. It was in a continuation of Fuller's ethical sensibilities that we ought to have a world that works for everybody. World Game is the other side of the coin of the war games, where a few people in the Pentagon, the Kremlin, in Beijing were figuring out the moves and counter moves for World War III, IV, and V, and trying to beat the other side. And Fuller thought, that's not what the world needs. To make this place work for everybody, it ought to be focused on not beating an ideology, capitalism, communism, or something. It ought to be focused on how do you beat the real enemies of humanity? Starvation, illiteracy, lack of health care, climate change, environmental destruction. The idea was to be accessible, not just to the generals and admirals and their research staff, but to the high school student, to the politician or their staff, to college researchers, to be available to everybody. And the idea was to develop strategies for making the world work. One version of it goes like this. Let's say the first 2 months could be focused on the global food problem. People would come from all over the world, different ages, different backgrounds, cultures, points of view, and work either together in teams or as individuals and come up, how do you feed the world? Let's say the strategy that was developed was, here's how you could do it in 10 years. You could eliminate not only starvation, but hunger and malnutrition in 10 years. Here's the resources you would need. the technology, how much money it would cost. That's round one. Round two is won by the team or individual that can do it, let's say, quicker in 8 years, or using less resources, or having it cost half as much and twice as good. And so you'd keep doing that until the strategies became so compelling. The first strategy might have said, well, here's how you could do it, but it costs $500 billion. The second one, here's how you can do it, and it'd be $100 billion. And the next one, here's how you could harness the power of the marketplace and 5 other things, and it would only be 500 million or 200 million, or it would use different technology. Anyhow, the idea would be to create more compelling strategies that would get themselves implemented. It wasn't just a game. It was all real world. You're not shooting imaginary fantasy aliens out of the sky. This is real world data, real world problems, real world solutions. And the culmination of the world game was not to be some cool strategy that gets in a book or on the internet and sits on the shelf or doesn't do anything. It gets implemented. And given technological advances, i.e. the personal computer, the internet, the vast quantity of information about the world that's now online. If you were in charge of a spacecraft, if you were in charge of any craft, ocean-going thing or a 747 airplane, you have a dashboard that tells you immediately what's going on. The wind speed or we're flying at this altitude, we've got plenty of fuel, everything is going well, or it's not going well. There's suddenly something wrong. The dashboard will tell you what's happening. So there's an Earth dashboard that we put together that is intended to give people a view of what's happening right now. Here's the energy fuel supply and how much we're using every second, as well as healthcare, education, all of the key variables on the planet. And Fuller used the word game purposefully. There was a childlike innocence in a lot of Fuller's work that is an invitation to use. And Fuller wanted to make sure that the world game was accessible to everybody and everybody's creativity and unique set of experiences that they're bringing to the problems of the world that might generate the insights needed to make the breakthrough, to make sure it's not only we feed, clothe, house everybody on the planet, but we do it in sustainable or even regenerative ways.
Alec, would you share a few of your thoughts on World Game?
It never actually happens. This is important to note. His vision of computing is very idealized. He does not have a lot of firsthand experience with computers. And so he never quite gets to the World Game as he conceives it, which would actually be played for real. What he does is he sponsors these seminars where people come together in small groups to discuss these problems, to do research on resource allocation. And starting in the late 60s, these World Game workshops are held all over the country, especially in New York and California. And there is this like a small subculture of people who are really excited by the concept of the World Game and are trying to make it happen for real. And again, it never really gets traction, but there is this interesting overlap between people who are interested in the World Game who also end up playing a part in the personal computer revolution. So people in Silicon Valley, or what becomes Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area especially, they're very aware of the World Game concept. And I think if you look at some of the early concepts for computer bulletin boards and networking and ways that we share information, a lot of it comes out of this community. And so Fuller didn't really have a direct impact on these things, but certainly like the environment that he created for these ideas is one that you can actually still see in some of the innovations that came out of the computer industry at that time.
Medard, would you talk about comprehensive anticipatory design science, and are these principles in use today?
When I was talking about the World Game, I alluded to the simplicity of its name, World Game. Underneath that simple word describing this fairly complex tool is something called comprehensive anticipatory design science. It is the methodology that one would use in developing strategies for the world. Comprehensive in that they deal with the whole world. Comprehensive that there are a systems approach that deals with not just an isolated incident in Uganda or a famine in Somalia, but it deals with the global food system in a comprehensive way that Fuller was convinced, as am I, that you can't deal with problems totally isolated from each other. Everything is interlinked to everything else. spiritual teachings have taught us that for eons, but today it's an economic reality or an economic truth, not just a spiritual or a moral one. Everything is interconnected in the global economy. So comprehensive means the big picture, dealing with all the different kinds of variables on the problem, looking at all of what's going on in the system that you're dealing with. Anticipatory means time. We know about the past, what is driving the system today in terms of trends of population, energy use, pollution, food, all the variables that are important. That's the past. They're showing up in the present day, but they're also going off into the future. You don't want to design your solution for today or tomorrow. You want to design it for when it's going to show up. A new automobile might take 3, 4, sometimes 5 years from the idea of it to it rolling off of the assembly line. The world is being forced to think anticipatory with climate change. A lot of people out there, politicians in particular, are only reacting to the manifestations as it shows up right now. The larger hurricanes, the more natural disasters, the consequences of not having dealt anticipatorily with climate change 20 years ago. So the scientific community has been aware of the dangers of climate change for a long time. So you want to deal with the problems of the world comprehensively and anticipatorily. Let's deal with them before they start wreaking havoc in the global economy and human beings are dying. Let's deal with them before things go critical. Design science, comprehensive anticipatory design science, design is a methodology for recognizing, defining, and solving the problems. How do you look at the global food problem, the global energy problem in a way that leads to solutions, not just documenting in ever more debilitating and depressing detail the problem, but how do you look at the problems in a creative way? Okay, here's the reality right now in this world, but here's where we want to be, the ideal state, not just a Band-Aid on the present state, but what is the ideal? Everybody's got the food they need in a sustainable way for all the coming generations. How do you design the system so that it's maybe not just sustainable, but it's regenerative? Regenerative being going beyond sustainability into a system that is stronger after you've produced and distributed the food than before. Regenerative agriculture, for example, the soil is stronger, better, more vibrant after you've produced your food than it was before. So you put all those together, comprehensive anticipatory design science, it's a way for changing the world. It's a way for looking at the world and recognizing the problems that exist in creative ways, in ways that will lead to the solutions of the problems that are considerate of everybody, that doesn't need a top-down totalitarian dictatorship to implement. That was also part of the world game. In a sense, it was Jeffersonian democracy applied globally rather than let's have some one all-powerful government implement these strategies for the world. That wasn't what Fuller was all about, and that's not what the world game or design science is about either. It's how do you create a world, how do you allow a world to grow and evolve in ways that are considerate of not just everybody and their values and perceptions and culture, but taps into those and uses that unique experiences of everybody in creative ways that contribute to making the world a better place.
Bonnie, how does comprehensive design science fit into Bucky's life story?
Well, he came up with that notion of what is the opposite of a specialist? That is a comprehensive, anticipatory design scientist. So a person by nature who is that would be transdisciplinary. There were some key principles that were part of CADS. I created an acronym for it back in the day. In the 90s when we had to keep on saying the words, and CADS has a few of his key ideas, which is whole systems thinking, what we spoke about earlier, the regenerative earth or eternally regenerative earth and Earth's processes where everything is recycled. We live in a universe that is recycling and reinventing itself from the tiniest material to the largest ideas. He talked about ephemeralization, doing more with less, using his intuition, because he said he didn't build his ideas on the shoulders of giants. He didn't fit into the process where he was citing these great thinkers before him, he was communing with nature directly. And in this communion with nature, his goal was exactly, like I said before, like Leonardo da Vinci's, who had discovered so many things just through his communing with nature. So finding nature's technologies through experiencing nature rather than going from abstract to concrete. What about going from concrete to abstract? He was also seeing humans' role as planetary citizens. We have to move out of this whole thing that I'm an American or I'm whatever racial characteristics that we have. And Bucky even said that there was so much cross-fertilization going on that we are losing the categories. And the new category is this much more comprehensive perspective. So nature's technology was something that he evolved his understanding of that. Precession, the effect of moving bodies on other moving bodies, was a very large part of his conceptual tool set. And synergy, the option of the whole being more than the sum of its parts, that whole to parts orientation. And especially in the last few years of his life, individual integrity. He said there's going to be a time when only individual integrity is going to count. That we have to find the deepest truth and stay true to that. And that was, in a sense, the guinea pig bee process, where he stayed true to this idea that he could serve all of humanity. He could serve the universe. And that was really part of CADS. CADS, or Comprehensive Anticipatory Design Science, was the manifestation toward the later part of his life of that complex principle and his dipping into many different disciplines rather than a single one.
Alec, another of Fuller's projects was the World Resource Inventory. What was the inventory, and how does it relate to ephemeralization?
So I'll start with ephemeralization because it kind of comes first chronologically in his career. So Fuller, as I said earlier, his initial goal starting in the 20s involves housing. And in particular, this idea of a house that can be mass produced in a factory. And he realizes kind of early on that for this to make sense, the house has to be very light. You cannot build a house out of brick or concrete and transport it the way that he's envisioning. It would overwhelm the national trucking system to do this. And so he comes up with this design for a house that is based on tension materials as opposed to compression. So instead of a house that's made of bricks or mortar or masonry, it's a house that is made of aluminum and hung on piano wire and made of plastic and other materials. So this is like a practical design principle that he arrives at. You want things to be lighter, in some ways more efficient. And so Fuller takes this practical principle and then expands it, as he tends to do, into something even more profound. So he says that things tend to start with compression, so like concrete or brick. They move into tension, which is lighter based on tension materials. And then they go from there into the visual and the abstract until you are doing everything with nothing. So this is a hard concept to get your head around sometimes, but it's actually saying we can do more with less. We can be more efficient in the way we use materials. And I think the way that technology evolves, we've seen that this is true. Like the way the computer or the cell phone has evolved over time, they are getting lighter. They are getting more abstract. They're doing more things with software and not hardware. And these are things that Fuller is essentially getting at in the late 20s, early 30s with this concept of ephemeralization. This is part one to that response. Part two involves sort of the more practical sense of how do we use resources more efficiently and how do we do more with less so we can achieve this goal that I mentioned earlier of trying to provide for all of humanity using the resources that we currently have. And this becomes an important part of Fuller's message, I would say, in the late 50s, early 60s. And what happens is that up until a certain point, Fuller's always trying to find ways of using existing systems to advance his ideas. And in the 50s, he's often looking at the military. He's looking at the US government. He's looking at corporations. So he's taking a very conventional approach to trying to sell designs like the dome and trying to raise money and trying to pursue these projects. And then later on, he starts to have trouble getting those commissions. He's earned some money from the military, but those patents are maybe expiring or the military is going to other designs. And so he needs to find like a new audience, a new system that he can use to advance his ideas. And what he does, and I found this really interesting, is that he is a really good teacher, and he's had great success leading these seminars at colleges where they will design a dome and work on a design prompt that he provides. And so he decides to take that to the next level. He says, instead of just going to individual colleges myself, I'm going to build this larger movement. I'm going to build this system of design seminars and design problems that will expand across the world. Because at this point, Fuller is teaching at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. So he has a base of operations. He says, so starting here, I'm going to encourage students at colleges everywhere across the world to pursue these design problems. And for him, the ultimate design problem is doing more with less. How do we find a way to use resources more efficiently? And he proposes that students, at different colleges independently start to research resource allocation. So compile numbers and statistics of how resources are actually used or misused, and then find ways of displaying this in a dramatic way so that people will understand the problem that designers have to confront. And initially, he speaks of this as though it's going to be this decentralized operation that he is not going to oversee directly, that students can kind of pursue independently at their own colleges. In the mid-60s, after he's done this for a little while, he says, you know what, actually, I'll take over this project because the students, they don't have the experience or the resources to do this themselves. So he ends up starting this World Resources Inventory project at Carbondale. And along with one of his colleagues named John McHale, he starts to compile data. He starts to compile information about fossil fuel usage, solar energy, wind power, mechanical efficiency. And these are designed to support his contention that if we make things more efficient, we can provide for everyone. And so he and McHale, they spend several years writing these reports, trying to publicize this idea. And they eventually conclude that, you can make the world's usage of resources just a bit more efficient. It doesn't have to be a huge change, but if you can make things 4% more efficient, then we'll have enough energy to provide for everyone in the world. And this kind of becomes his message at this point, in the late 60s. And it's a very attractive message. This is a time when the environmental movement is getting started and people are thinking about things like sustainability for the first time. And Fuller's message is basically, this is the data. These are the numbers. And if we can get this information out there and publicize it and give people the tools they need to understand it, people will conclude that the current system isn't working. And later on, this idea evolves and takes different incarnations as Fuller's approach changes. But this idea that the data's there, it's just a matter of publicizing it and making sure that people understand the situation, I think is actually a pretty powerful one.
It seems like it was so important to Fuller, to this idea of being of benefit to humanity. Does that relate to his world design science decade?
Yeah, so basically the map, the geoscope, the world game, and the world design science a decade documents and program were all ways of walking around the very same thing of stewardship of the earth through aligning and synchronizing human efforts and letting them demonstrate to themselves through looking at these trends and curves of change, looking at them as this wisdom of the crowd that we used to call it, this global brain, as it's also been called, that what if humanity was working in a synchronized way? So that was really part of this idea for architecture students to redesign the world when we only have 10 years to, as he said, turn the ship around. He imagined we would be at this tipping point, which actually this tipping point we've been in for quite some time. I don't know if we have 10 years. He didn't know when this would happen, but he did say that in 10 years, we can turn the ship around and become the stewards that we need to be by shifting our focus on the regenerative qualities of not just universe or the earth, but of humans, of human evolution itself.
Are you ready for 2 cards this time? The first is number 3748, Design Science. Man is born a potentially complete success. The reason humanity loves its children is that they start off in such perfection of potential. Man, as designed, is obviously intended to be a success, just as the hydrogen atom is intended to be a success. It's only the fabulous ignorance of man and his long and wrongly conditioned reflexes that has continually allowed the new life to be impaired, albeit lovingly and unwittingly. Number 736, artist. By the word art, I mean integrity of individual communication, independent of the medium of its articulation. Chapter 5, A New Design Science Decade. Roxanna Shohadaee is an artivist, a futurist, a designer, and social sculptor with over 15 years of experience in art, science, and technology. Her mission is to catalyze social and systemic change through inclusive, transdisciplinary collaborations for the regeneration of our planet and culture. Roxy is the founder and CEO of Hab Ritual, an experiential production, interdisciplinary design, and immersive art studio creating for 100% of life. Roxy, what is the Design Science Studio?
The Design Science Studio is, at its heart, an educational incubator and community for artists and designers who are helping to propel an equitable, regenerative, just future for all life. And that is the core of it. How that looks in the world is that we invite creators of all types at all stages of their careers to band together on this collective mission and harness the principles of design science, a la comprehensive anticipatory design science. It's also connected to the Design Science Decade. So we've retooled the Design Science Decade of Bucky from the 60s. We had made all the right tools for all the wrong reasons, but we have enough time to turn the ship around. And so we've harnessed that and brought it back to this era of the 2020s to the 2030s and said, okay, let's use all of our creative power to help to transform the world through design science and regenerative artivism and bring this collective mission, which is very much rooted in regenerative design. So regenerative design teaches us also to build the capacity of the system to help the system thrive. And so in that spirit, we're building the capacity of creators from all around the world who have a shared goal, which is to help make the world work for all life. And by having that shared goal, everyone comes together. The format has been cohorts. So we've done 2 cohorts, or cohorts as we call them, capital arts, of 144 creators. And they all say yes to the shared mission, and they create series of works, initiatives, projects that help to bring this mission to life. And then they're along the ride for this decade-long mission. They're alumni afterwards. And so far, we have graduated 288 evolutionaries. We've had over 60-some educators supporting that mission as visionaries. And it is made by a partnership between Hab Ritual and the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Hab Ritual is my creative studio. It is through this partnership that we saw this opportunity to say, okay, if we are in this really important regenerative transition, how do we create intentional space, mentored space to work across disciplines and help put some of these radically important principles to work to support the capacity building for creators to better harness these principles of nature, ecology, science, creativity, and design to imagine and actualize this future that's regenerative, equitable, and just. In order to move towards this kind of protopian world where all life is thriving at the expense of none, we need this thriving, regenerative, cultural, social, systemic evolution in service to that future.
Could you talk about a few of the projects that come to mind that could help people visualize what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. We have creators of all kinds, right? I'll frame it to say there's 2D, 3D, 4D artists, painters, illustrators, creative code, AI artists, data visualization, AR, VR, game designers, community organizers, interaction designers, product designers, architects, philosophers, producers, performers, musicians, scientists, poets. It is a very comprehensive group of humans who are working to transform our collective capacity and create a harmonic future. So we got to envision that. And so some of the ideas that have come through in no particular order, Future Meme is an amazing artist who created a project called Super Reality, and it is a augmented reality AI project that is giving a voice to Gaia. If you can imagine, if we could hear the plants and the earth speak back to help to animate some of the changes that are happening in our environment. Trove as this amazing social impact network and collection platform that kind of works as knowledge management and a way for collective decision making. John Van Meter did a project called Magic Cube. So it's completely based on synergetics. It's about low-cost shelter for unhoused populations. There's a decolonial think tank called Counterspace. Monica Blyski joined, who does a lot of great work with Protopia Futures, which is about proactively prototyping possible futures that center and uplift previously marginalized voices and kind of move us towards a protopian vision of the world. Amanda Sage is an incredible painter, and Alicia Sacred Heart created the Vision Train, which is a nonstop 24-hour art train on Zoom all the time. It's a huge community now of people creating and a lot of invitation for artivism. Casey House is another synergeticist, created SynU, Synergetics University, taking the work of Buckminster Fuller and making it a little bit more accessible through art, through many courses, because there's so few people who have actually read Synergetics, and it's pretty dense. I've met at least 10 people at this point who have said it was the most important book they'd ever read, or series of books they've ever read. There's a talk show from the year 2030 that Hannah Apricot Ekberg runs. It invites all the guests to say, here we are in 2030. Let's look back and share about the success stories over the last decade that brought us to a good place. And one last one I'll mention, I could keep going, but there's over 200 projects. Shanita King, who is this incredible Black queer artist and activist in Portland, is doing a bunch of work around artivism, but specifically art and art meditations. And they're targeted specifically towards primarily people in their community, but also anyone who is connected to how art can help be a meditation for people across cultures to help them feel kind of safer, reconnecting to that which is their birthright, which is the natural world.
What's your hope for the project, and what are some ideal outcomes from it?
At the baseline, we have this potential of a flourishing of creative design science movement where we have social and systemic capacity for regenerative change emerging and becoming foundational and embedded within traditional institutions and across planetary culture. For community connection, we can have this flourishing of this cross-sector creative collaborations that have established evolutionary cultural narratives and regenerative relational ecosystems. The Design Science Decade has the most magnificent potential of the Design Science Decade to move towards a more protopian narrative, and it has been largely aided by the creativity that helps fuel cultural change. And that looks like changes across all sectors towards a more collaborative society that is more rooted in these principles of and with nature and working together in more of this visionary way that we're living it and not just talking about it. And that might look like completely different governance systems. But I think for the program, we'll have graduated 10 years of creators. We'll have really established more of what we are currently calling this expeditionary program, which is more cross-disciplinary mentorship and partnership. And so looking at this in a full systemic way, we hope that it can grow to have different chapters, bioregional hubs, spaces where Regenera are. So Regenera is this floating city that was born out of the Design Science Studio, and it's a protopian narrative and world that essentially tells the story of floating city that docks periodically around the world, that is the full embodiment of this potential actualized. And so as it docks periodically around the world and people can go into Regenera and experience what's possible, they come back from that speculative future and they're inspired to take action now to move towards something that may have seemed not within reach. And so Regenera will also, in its fullest potential, dock all the time. There will be many portals into Regenera, and all of the different initiatives, projects of the different creators are in some way linked to it and a part of it. And so helping elevate the critical importance of new narratives for cultural change as a fundamental part of a design science revolution. The future vision is that culture has really understood how important it is. It's adopted inside of different kinds of institutions, organizations, and that we're able to, as a program, as a community, and an ecosystem, provide the resources so that those within the community can also be able to really focus on this important work. We don't have as much time as we really, at this point, need to really band together and move as swiftly as we can towards a more regenerative, equitable, just world.
Round and round she goes, and where she stops, 9,416, life. Only life's temporary vehicles can be destroyed. Life is inherently immortal. And right next door, 9,412, life once more. The regeneration of universe probably depends on local monitors of very high capability to solve very complex problems. Certainly, our lives manifest just problems, problems, problems. Nothing could be more descriptive of life than problems. But we have a beautiful sorting capability. Chapter 6, Bucky's Legacy. Alec, if Fuller was around today, what might his priorities be, do you think, and how might he have pursued them?
The big difference between where Fuller was during his lifetime and where things are now, among other things, I would say is access to venture capital. So Fuller, I said earlier, is sort of a startup founder who in some ways was born a generation or two too soon. I think he had trouble raising money for his ideas. He was never able to really do more than break even for much of his life, and he did not become rich. And I think that if he were around now, his set of skills, his charisma, his ability to reach a large audience, the way that he is able to tie together different ideas, and again, this philosophy of design as a way of solving problems, it's very close to the way a lot of startup founders raise money. And I think he would do well. I think he would have succeeded incredibly well in modern Silicon Valley. And so that's a big difference. I think he would have actually had more resources than he did have if he were around today. The other question is, what problems would he be focusing on? And, I find it interesting because, a lot of startups, they focus on software. They're building an app. There's a reason for this. It's that it's easier to start something when you don't have the need for a lot of infrastructure and a lot of physical machinery to do something. It's harder to build a device. This is why fewer startups are working on hardware because the startup costs are greater. And Fuller, for him, housing was always the biggest issue. My question is, what does that look like? What does a startup focusing on housing look like? Because he was right. He saw housing as a human right. And the idea of affordable housing was hugely important to him early on. And I do think he would be pursuing that project. How that would look and how feasible that would be is a different question. I don't think it necessarily would be a dome. I think the dome was just one instance of those ideas that took different forms over the course of his career. I don't know what materials he'd be using. I don't know what approach he'd be taking. But I do think that there's a very plausible scenario in which the Fuller of today would be trying to do for housing what he was trying to do in the 20s and 30s using today's technology and capital.
Let's talk about Bucky Fuller, the teacher. Bonnie, you were lucky enough to meet him as a teacher late in his life, but what did the role of teacher mean in his overall trajectory?
Well, his daughter Allegra really felt that he was an educator at heart, that he was a natural teacher. And in fact, he was. This didn't really start happening in the university system until he was in his 50s. And then he found that he was a great lecturer, and he was able to teach the very first lab classes, learning by doing or praxis. And he worked with many different students, but most of the work that he did in finalizing the geodesic mass that would enable you to create both a geodesic sphere for a geoscope or a geodesic dome for a celestial theater or home shelter. He worked with Jeffrey Lindsay in Canada, Duncan Stewart and Don Richter, Ken Snelson. The mathematics was being worked out by these individuals.
And as a teacher, he was really hands-on, right? This learning by doing model of teaching?
Exactly. Praxis, where you really can't understand something until you've built it. And it goes back to his idea that if you can't make a model of it, don't talk about it. So everything was hands-on, multisensory, engaging all of the senses. And he learned as much from the students as they learned from him doing this process. And he felt that that was a much better way to teach than simply being an expert, a specialist that taught your specialty to the students.
Daniel, in your estimation, what is Bucky Fuller's legacy?
Buckminster Fuller revolutionized systems of education. He revolutionized programs of design. He taught in architecture schools. He taught in design schools. He taught in engineering programs. He taught at graduate level, at entry level. And the legacy of comprehensively pursuing a series of systems that explored geometry and that explored fabrication and that explored assembly and that explored multiple uses, multiple functions, and that worked together. So his inexhaustible persona traveling and then teaching at many, many, many programs all simultaneously at once was this extraordinary precedent to the way that we run design programs today, where we have rapid prototyping and we have faculty traveling incessantly across many programs and forming patterns of collaboration. And in doing so, his output then transformed so many different other dimensions. The legacy of this teaching and of these manuals and of his work with the students led to the whole Earth catalog and to a whole emergence of a new environmental consciousness. Obviously, the patterns of the solids to the domes, and then the domes becoming the geoscope, and then the geoscope becoming the Earth, and then the Earth, the cosmos, and then the insistence to understand our place within a much larger spaceship Earth foreshadowed an entire ecological movement. There's so many dimensions of his legacy. The others that I would emphasize that are less known are, of course, with the Synergetics Dictionary and with this entire project on writing, and then his project on intellectual property. I am reminded that patents are only one instance of variations of patents that preceded those patents, and they're published to be found and to be picked up by others in the future to continue to develop that knowledge further. Patents don't exist in a vacuum. They are transformations of knowledge. Although one is the inventor, one is continuing to work on these lines. And I think that possibly that legacy of Fuller's patents continuing to be cited today in the hundreds. With the book, I had a chance to first outline the 28 patents and all the variations and all the citations. And then I began to find that each of these patents continue to be cited in the present and every year since his death. Literally, it's a continuing of his design projects into all kinds of unimaginable applications, from music instruments to coral reef saving artifacts to energy wave mechanisms to more closely Dymaxion variations of it. So to me, that's probably one of the richest and most unexplored legacies that he has.
Alec, who are some of the people and events that have unfolded since Fuller's death in 1983 that point to the depth of Fuller's realizations?
So the answer is, to me, anyway, it's in the sciences. I think that Fuller's geometry, which I've talked about a lot, there are useful concepts there. And the best way I can explain this is to say that his most famous design is the geodesic dome. And he arrives at the dome at a time in his career when he does not have a lot of resources. He does not have a lot of money to use, as I was saying earlier, the incredible costs of trying to develop shelter. But the dome is a design that he can build in a college seminar. It's very simple. It's this hemisphere with these triangulated elements to it that you can build out of cardboard. You can build it out of plywood. You can build it out of wire and sticks. To him, that's a huge advantage. And so he takes the dome to like different college seminars and gives design prompts to these students. And, this has to be a simple design. It has to be simple enough so that you can give these instructions to some college kids and have them build a structure in a few weeks. And eventually the dome is refined by Fuller and his collaborators to the point where the instructions for a dome fit on like one piece of paper. It's like a list of numbers and a diagram, and it's very simple. And again, so this is for a practical reason. The dome would not have succeeded if it were not simple. And so all these rules that he arrives at to build a dome have to be very simple. And what I find incredibly interesting is that a lot of these rules end up being very similar to how nature builds. And people who are involved in fields like virology see similarities in the shell of a virus and the dome. And I think it happens for some other reasons. I think nature, like Fuller, is trying to do things in a very efficient way. It's trying to do things in ways that are simple, that can be reproduced for minimal cost. And so, so these rules, they kind of parallel, they independently arrive at some of the same places that nature does for similar reasons. And so during Fuller's lifetime, he is corresponding with virologists. He's talking to biologists about cell structure. And very soon after his death, people in biology and in chemistry find applications for these ideas. And so the most famous example is in 1985 at Rice University in Texas. This team of scientists is working on carbon molecules, and they discover a new kind of carbon molecule that had never been described before that has the shape of a geodesic sphere. And they actually go to the library and check out one of Fuller's books to look at pictures of domes to get ideas for how this molecule would be structured. And they eventually call it Buckminster Fullerene, the buckyball. And this is not just a random homage to Fuller. His ideas end up being incredibly useful when it comes to describing this molecule, which ends up in some ways like inaugurating the modern phase of nanotechnology and kind of making it plausible that you could build structures and materials on the molecular level. It's really fascinating. And I think those ideas are valuable. And again, some other reasons, like the buckyball takes on a certain shape because nature is following similar rules that Fuller arrived at to build the dome. Again, like he's not copying nature. He's very clear about this. He's not copying natural structures. He is arriving at these principles because he needs them, because he needs things to be simple. And so you asked about his legacy now. And if I were in one of these fields, I would totally look at Fuller's work because I think there are concepts there and there are tools there that are incredibly provocative.
Bonnie, you mentioned this at the very start, but could you talk a bit more about the chronophile? You consider it to be Fuller's greatest artifact. Am I right?
Yes, I do. And when we moved the Institute from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara, midway through my time there, I organized everything to fit into 2 semis. And after we weighed them, we found that it was 96,000 pounds of personal history. Let me tell you a little bit about what that looked like. He had a chronophile. He borrowed the term chronophile from the Navy about chronologically understanding the time frame of where something is. So he organized everything into what the heart of the archives is, which is a chronophile of bound volumes, scrapbooks of everything that came in and out of his life, plus 5 large broadsheet size scrapbooks of the publicity, the full page, front page stories on him way back in the 30s. And then he found that he was creating so much paper, he was carting this around with him. And eventually he was able to organize it better, but really using this framework of chronology to bring that together. So he had his photos, his slides, thousands of articles and manuscripts, carbon copies of all of his correspondence outgoing, personal items, brochures, announcements, project notes, his legal documents, his prior art searches for many of the patents that he did, the correspondence of his personal, public, and professional life, created this huge body. So if you look at this, it's 56 years of doggedly determined rigor to keep everything that documented what one individual can do. Now, it is at Stanford University. They bought it in 1999, and it's been processed over the last couple of decades and is available to researchers, students, professors, and the general public for research. So you can actually view the Crown of File volumes. You can view his blueprints and all of the materials that surround every single building project and prototype program that he led. It's such a voluminous body of materials, but his original organization of it was fairly solid. It's one of the most unusual personal archives in existence. It is one of the most extensive on paper. And we live in a digital world. You can think about everything you do, every letter you write is time-coded, location-based. Every photo you take is time-coded, location-based. So that was a framework that Bucky used in the physical world to organize his papers. So this body of physical paper and materials is doing the same thing that each and every one of us is doing right now. We're creating a record of everything we think, everything we do, everything we communicate with and for and to each other. So it's a much more common thing now, but he was the only one doing it the way that he did it during his lifetime last century.
Any final Bucky thoughts, Daniel?
Every time we speak about nature, we presume that nature is here and that we're here, so that we are outside of nature, that we are actually not part of, or that there is this separation. And what Bucky allows us to do is to dissolve that line and to see ourselves immersed and participating in these larger patterns.
Bonnie, the idea of the average man dedicated to benefiting all humanity. Sometimes Fuller talked about a trim tab. What's your take on this idea of the trim tab?
Well, I'd like to maybe speak to that with a couple of his own quotes about himself as a trim tab. And I think the archives is very central to that because he's showing us, how can you be a trim tab? How can small things that you do impact and affect the whole world, like the butterfly effect as we know it today? He wrote, "I hope that the record so documented and your hoped for by me close examination of it will serve as an encouragement to you as individuals to undertake tasks that you can see need to be attended to, which are not to the best of your knowledge being attended to by others, and for which there are no capital backers." He also said, "I am presenting all these thoughts and records because I think we are coming to a very extraordinary moment in the history of humanity when only such a spontaneous, competent, and ultimately cooperative design science initiative taking on the part of a large majority of human individuals can ensure humanity's safe crossing of the cosmically critical threshold into its prime and possibly eternal functioning in the macro-micro cosmic scheme." And this clarifies his brain, or it was in this cosmic relevance of the human being, the impact every human being can make is exemplified in the impact and influence that he not only made, but documented in his own life. So in a sense, it was really a comprehensive approach. I know that the passion that he had and the urgency about us really taking hold of the responsibility, not just the freedom of being human. He was all about the responsibilities of what it means to be human. And that is exemplified in the record that he left.
Why did you title your book Inventor of the Future? And to elaborate on that, do you foresee synergetics and the geometry being fruitful in the future for further discovery and insights?
I do. It was actually my publisher who proposed that title, and I agreed because I liked it and because I realized that inventor has two meanings. An inventor can be someone who invents devices, designs, and the way that Fuller claimed to improve people's lives and to solve problems. But an inventor can also be someone who invents themselves. An inventor can be someone who shapes a narrative And I think this is very true of Fuller as well. As I think I may have mentioned before, Fuller was kind of a myth maker. He did invent aspects of his life that do not quite fit with the facts if you go back and look at the original sources. And so to me, that is his other real legacy. And I'm glad you mentioned that because the ideas are very powerful. I don't want to understate how interesting I find Fuller's geometry and some of those concepts. But the persona that he invented is also a powerful one. In some ways, his greatest invention is this image of the design visionary, the comprehensivist, which we kind of today think of as the startup founder. It's an approach to solving problems and to getting things done that has worked. You could argue about the outcome. And I think this is an important part of the book's message is that we have to look closely at people like this and ask ourselves, are these really the ways to solve problems that we're facing? But there's no question about how effective it can be. A person like Fuller, who is charismatic and who can create enthusiasm about design ideas, is a model for people who are doing similar things today. And I think that is where Fuller's importance lies, that he is an incredible instance of a kind of person who has had a disproportionate influence on the world that we're living in right now.
Bonnie, are there any other final thoughts that you have that you'd like to share?
Yes. Well, I know you asked me about what it felt like to meet him or see him speak so many times and then to work within his mind in the center of the archives. He was all about empowering the next generation. And he did feel like students were much more open to the ideas that he was throwing out there. But what I loved about him is he felt like a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is an enlightened being who stays on earth until everyone is enlightened. And I felt that it wasn't like a cult or a guru experience at all. It was more about he was a man of the future. He spoke like a man of the future. He thought like a man of the future. But what he did the last time I saw him, and that was a long one, that was about 7 hours, the whole audience of thousands stood up. We were all very young. And he opened his arms, looked up at all of us, and said, "I wish you can see yourselves as I see you now." And that gave you a little bit of a thunk in the gut, like, okay, he's passing a baton to us. We have to take responsibility. It is our job while we're young to make these changes. And that's what we see in the world now is the student-led projects and programs are getting larger and larger. But the urgency and passion with which Bucky spoke were the things that resonated with all of us. Even if it was a little esoteric or even if we didn't understand everything, we understood it in our hearts and we understood what it meant for our lives. We have to ask, what can one woman do? Let's say I had 2 little babies and I was raising them and putting myself through school by myself. And I said, when I was seeing Bucky these last times, I said to myself, what can one woman do with 2 little kids? And I think that empowered me in ways that I don't think I could have done what I've done in my own life, professionally and personally, if I hadn't been influenced by him as an example.
How about one more spin? Card number 9438, Life and Death. Life is an inventory of in and out tunings. Birth is the first tuning in. Death may not be the last. Thanks for joining us for Holy Moly What a Life, featuring Buckminster Fuller. And thank you to our guests, Bonnie DeVarco, Alec Nevala-Lee, Daniel López-Pérez, Medard Gabel, and Roxanna Shohadaee. Special thanks go out to everyone who subscribes to Catalyst on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus programs, including an interview with Faith Flanagan of the Buckminster Fuller Institute and the complete Daniel López-Pérez interview. This episode of Holy Moly What a Life was edited and mixed by Chris Sanders, with additional editing by Chris Porro. Our music was composed by Oki Gushiken and Darren Chorley, with sound design by Gijsbert Amboscher and Jay Blanchett. Our delightful Holy Moly theme music is by Twen. The executive producers are Chicky Munch, and Binny Bunny Munch with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you like the show, please add, comment, and like Holy Moly on your favorite podcast platform. This is Ed Goldberg signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.